Welcome, everybody, to this Baldwin webinar. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Peter Havens, and I have the honor and pleasure of being the chairman of Baldwin Management. And our guest speaker this afternoon is Dr. Rebecca Pincus. Dr. Pincus is a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and previously she was the director of the Polar Institute at the Wilson Center and served on the faculty of the U.S. Naval War College, where her research focused on Arctic security and geopolitics. She also worked in the Office of the Secretary of Defense for policy as Arctic and Climate Strategy Advisor. She's testified before Congress in the U.S.-China Commission on Security and Defense in the polar regions, and her research has been published widely in peer-reviewed outlets. So without further ado, I bring you Dr. Pincus. Hello, Rebecca.
Hello. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you all today, and thank you, Peter, for that very nice introduction. It's great to be here. Unless you have any further comments, I'll dive right in. I'm looking forward. Okay, great. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I've got about a dozen slides and comments to run through, and then we'll move into Q&A, which I think will be the real meat of the discussion. I'm looking forward to that. So let me get going here with my slides. Please let me know if you have any issues seeing the slides. And again, I'm looking forward to doing a bit of an overview of U.S. strategic interests in the Arctic and some of the major drivers that are shaping interest in the region these days. There has been quite a bit of interest in the Arctic. Obviously, a lot of that has been linked to interest on the part of the administration in Greenland, which came to a bit of a head in January of this year. But I will note that there's been sustained and really growing interest in the Arctic over the last several years for a number of reasons. And we'll run through those. But at the outset, I think it's important to note that the Arctic is a region that is changing drastically. So the physical environment is changing, and that's changing human access to the region. It's also the part of the world where there's been less development than we might expect given the rich resource endowment there. So, you know, the world has known for a century that the Arctic is a storehouse of natural resources, everything from hydrocarbons, minerals and metals, fish, other potential resources, like wood, gemstones. I could go on, but there's a lot of valuable resources in the Arctic region. There, as yet, has not been really sustained and intensive extraction, and that has been it's been held up for a number of reasons, but one of those is access. And with the changing physical environment, there's a lot of questions about increased human access to the region and changing sort of return on investment with regards to those resources. So there's a lot of interest in Arctic natural resources. There's also a lot of interest in potential navigation through the region. So we'll talk about Arctic shipping lanes. And at root, the Arctic is the connector region that bridges between North America and Eurasia. It's the shortest distance on the globe between North America and Eurasia. And so that's been important for strategic reasons, for missile trajectories. It's been important for air connections. And, you know, it's sort of the inescapable geography that makes the Arctic important to the United States. Although our interest in it, I would say, our being the United States, our interest has sort of waxed and waned with, with the security environment and some of the resource questions. So at the outset, I think I wanted to kind of sketch what I'm going to be talking to you about today. And again, now we'll dive into the slides. We'll get into a few more specifics, and then we can all talk about it towards the end here. So, first off, I think the changes in the Arctic. Let me see if I can get my slides to advance here real quick. Hang on just a second here. I'm going to stop sharing and make sure I can get my slides to advance. Let's see. That seems to be working. Okay, they seem to be working for me. So let me try resharing and seeing if I can advance here. Share. There we go. Okay, terrific. So you all should see a couple of charts on your screen here. On the left is a chart of the Arctic region. We're looking straight down at the North Pole here, and you can see the Arctic states around the Arctic Ocean. You can see Alaska and Canada. You can see Greenland and Russia. And that white blob in the center there is Arctic sea ice. And then on the right-hand side, you can see a graph showing the reductions in Arctic sea ice extent. And all the colorful lines on the bottom of that graph are basically the last few years. And the gray is the historic median from about 1980 to 2010. So we are seeing significant shrinking in Arctic sea ice that is sustained. The snapshot on the left is the geographic extent of Arctic sea ice in September. September is the point of the year when there is the minimum. It's after all of the summer melting. We see the lowest amount of sea ice in September. It's called the sea ice minimum. And on the left there, you can see that white ice, and you can see a little yellow line around the outside of it. That yellow line is the median ice extent, again, from about 1980 to 2010. So you can see that what we've got last September, which is fairly standard for the modern era, is well inside the historic median. We're seeing significant downward trends in Arctic sea ice extent. It's losing something like 12 to 15% per decade. It's on a one-way trajectory. It's pretty glaring. It's the most significant thing. If you leave here with any knowledge about the Arctic, please understand that the Arctic sea ice is shrinking. We're not expecting it to come back. It's sort of on a one-way trajectory, and that is really changing everything about the region because sea ice is the central organizing condition of the Arctic region. Sea ice mediates global weather and climate, but it also strongly controls weather and climate around the Arctic, and that has an influence on land conditions. It has an influence on, human operations, weather, all sorts of things. So the sea ice is really important, and the sea ice is shrinking. And it's shrinking in more than just geographic extent. So I think that's something that a lot of folks don't fully appreciate. Again, you're looking at a couple of charts here. This is going to be a little bit dense, but I will walk you through it. And I promise the science is going to stop soon. But on the left, you see a snapshot of historic Arctic sea ice. On the right, you see a snapshot of sea ice from 2023. And the thing that you can see, the differences that you can see between those two pictures, the old one on the left again and the new one on the right, not only is there less ice, right? There's a smaller amount of ice in the center of the Arctic Ocean there, but the colors have changed. If you look at the key on the bottom of those indices, you see the old ice is red and yellow. Red ice is over 4 years. It's called multi-year ice. It's extremely thick. It's extremely hard to break. It's like concrete. Yellow ice is 3 or 4, or the yellow color is sort of middle 3 to 4 year old ice. And then green, and then the blue and the darker blue, that's the much younger ice. So if it's dark blue, it's just formed that year and melted away. If it's light blue, it's 1 to 2 year ice. These are very young areas of ice. If they're young, they're thinner and they're much easier to break. So the transformation that you're looking at between these two pictures is the near total loss of multi-year Arctic sea ice. And that's really important because, again, that multi-year sea ice is the hard stuff. It's the thick stuff. It's really hard to break through with a ship. It's also really important habitat for Arctic species, but you can see a really drastic change there. So the Arctic sea ice that we have now, there's less of it in space, right? The geographic extent of it is shrinking, but also the volume or mass of it is shrinking as well because it's getting thinner, right? We don't have as much of the really, really thick multi-year ice. We have more 1 or 2 year old ice that's much thinner. So there's less volume or mass of it. And also the season of ice extent is shrinking. So the temporal extent of ice is shrinking, and there's now a longer period of navigation in the late summer. So it used to be that you could sail through the margins of the Arctic for, just a few weeks in August and September. And now that period of navigation is getting longer and longer. So Arctic sea ice is shrinking in 3 dimensions. It's shrinking in spatial extent, it's shrinking in volume or mass because it's getting thinner, and it's also shrinking in time. So I think that's, I spent a lot of time on sea ice here. I apologize to start out with that, but I think it's really, really important to get kind of a nuanced understanding of how much is changing in the region. And that gets us right to the question of navigability, because those shipping lanes are opening up, and they're opening up again. The sea ice is shrinking out of them. There's the ice that is remaining is increasingly thin and easy to break up with icebreakers. And the season of potentially navigating through those shipping lanes is growing. So that is part of the reason there's so much interest in Arctic shipping. And there are a couple of major potential Arctic shipping lanes that are opening up. And again, I'm going to just go back up. You can look at the sea ice extent. Again, the picture on the right-hand side is current 2023, but sort of it gives you an idea of what sea ice looks like these days, this decade. Look at the margins on the Russian coastline. Look at the Canadian Arctic archipelago. We're not seeing ice there, right? And so that's where these shipping lanes are. On the right-hand side, in the orange, you see a shipping lane across Russia's northern coast. That's the Northern Sea Route. On the left-hand side, in red, you see shipping through the Canadian Arctic archipelago. That's the Northwest Passage. There is some interest in a shipping lane straight across the middle of the Arctic Ocean. That would be called the Transpolar Route, but that is still notional at this point. It does not open up. There's still sea ice around the North Pole, the Central Arctic Ocean now that would prohibit shipping through the Central Arctic. But you can drive ships through the Northwest Passage and the Northern Sea Route. It is not yet easy to do, particularly the Northwest Passage going through the Canadian Arctic archipelago. As you can see from just looking at this chart, on the Canadian side, you're driving through a set of narrow channels. And as you might expect, those channels have some draft restrictions. There are some navigation hazards. It's important to know that many parts of the Northwest Passage have not had hydrographic charting up to modern standards. So in many cases, mariners are dealing with very outdated charts. So there are a fair amount of navigation hazards there. And one thing that you can't see just from this chart is that the Canadian Arctic archipelago is sort of one of the areas where sea ice collects. It sort of piles up in the Arctic region. So there is still sort of a fair amount of ice hazards for much of the year. But there is some shipping through the Northwest Passage, particularly servicing small Arctic communities and some of the major industrial projects. There are a few big mines in Canada's Arctic, and so there is destinational shipping to get to those communities and those mines. There are also an increasing number of pleasure craft transiting the Northwest Passage, and that would be cruise ships and adventure yachts. So sailing through the Northwest Passage is, again, it's a bit tricky to do. There are some draft restrictions. You have to kind of pick your way sometimes, which is a good fit for a cruise ship or a small cruise ship. Or a yacht that has a little bit more flexibility with regards to time. The other side of the Arctic, the Northern Sea Route, that route along Russia's northern coast, that is open, and that is the easier of the two. So there are, as you can see, it's just sort of an easier shot along the coastline there. There are a couple of passages through archipelagos where there are some draft restrictions, but overall it is a much easier path. And it is also an area where there's been a lot of loss of sea ice. So the sea ice kind of moves away from the Russian coastline there. And there has been an uptick in shipping through the Northern Sea Route. I will say the war in Ukraine has changed the calculus for the NSR pretty significantly because of the sanctions regime and sort of the general how do I want to put this? You know, Russia is maybe not the friendliest country to be sailing alongside. So we have not seen a lot of traffic through the NSR, although I will say it is Russia's fondest hope that the NSR becomes part of world shipping lanes. They've been trying to develop the Northern Sea Route for a long time. I'll talk about that more in a minute. But you know, from a navigation perspective, the NSR is more practical. But again, the open season is still a few months in the summertime. These shipping routes, the Arctic region freezes up in the wintertime. There has been a fair amount of winter sea ice loss in the Barents Sea off of Norway. But in terms of sort of the central Arctic, in terms of the Russian coastline, in terms of Canada and Alaska, you know, we're still seeing ice extent that would block navigation. The ice is thinner. It is easier to break. If you have an icebreaker escort, you can get farther for longer. But icebreaker escorts are expensive and sort of complicated. So we have not yet seen a really significant uptake of shipping through the Arctic region. I'm sure we'll, you know, have some questions about that in the Q&A. Shipping through the Arctic is, you know, there's been a lot of excitement about it for a long, long time. It is more feasible than it was 10 or 20 years ago. There are still these challenges around draft restrictions, around charting. There's still a relatively austere shoreside context. So in terms of ports of debarkation, fueling points, sort of ports of refuge, there is not a lot of shore support. Obviously, on the Russian side, there's been a lot of challenges doing business with Russia. And the time limitations, the seasonality of Arctic shipping, and the navigational uncertainty means that insurance is still a real challenge. There isn't a fixed insurance regime for shipping through the Arctic. And, you know, the time delays, the potential for time delays is something that has held a lot of shippers back. You know, the weather and the climate is unpredictable. We're seeing a lot of changes in seasonality around ice. There's some very bad weather. There's some additional hazards like freezing fog that ships have to deal with. The IMO introduced something called the Polar Code several years ago, almost a decade ago, that imposes special requirements for shipping through the Arctic, which some shippers find onerous. So there have been a lot of barriers to adoption of Arctic shipping routes. That may change in the future. We have not seen really significant adoption of these shipping routes, but we're seeing enormous disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, for example. You know, so if something like, you know, if the Hormuz closure goes on for a long time, if the challenges that the Panama Canal has had with drought persist or become more severe, you know, then I think we might see more interest in Arctic shipping. But right now, there are better alternatives. And again, you know, people ask me a lot about the future of Arctic shipping, and I usually say, look outside of the region, right? Look at you know, the Red Sea, look at Panama, because it's, you know, right now, again, shippers sort of have better alternatives, but if some of those better alternatives go down, we may see some really significant shift into the region. We can talk more about that at the end here. I'll keep moving. I want to turn to security real quick because that's kind of another major bucket of US interests. And as I had said at the top, the Arctic is the connector between North America and Eurasia. So from a continental defense, from a homeland defense perspective, the Arctic has always been really important to America. Going back to World War I, World War II, the Arctic was an important theater, particularly World War II, with the advent of ICBMs during the Cold War. All of a sudden, the Arctic became the vector route for missiles coming in from Eurasia. And so, it's always been important. It's sort of the northern shield for North America. And I've got a picture here of the ADIZ, the Air Defense Identification Zones, and our Homeland Defense, Continental Defense radar coverage. And so you can see, we have two big radars in Clear, Alaska, and in Thule, Greenland. The Thule one is now has been renamed Batufik. Those radars point north, and they give us, early warning of missiles coming in over the region, potentially striking the U.S. homeland. That is incredibly important. We can talk a little bit about Golden Dome. That's, the missile defense interest is driving a lot of the administration's interest in Greenland, I would say. And, the radar system that we have for continental defense that is linked to Canada through the NORAD binational command, those radars do need to be upgraded. NORAD modernization has been something that's been talked about for a very, very long time. The US and its allies are confronting a new generation of missiles and missile delivery systems like hypersonics, for which, our radars, need to be upgraded to meet those new challenges. So I think there's a very important conversation around NORAD modernization, missile detection. We could have a conversation about missile interception. We've got interceptors in Alaska. We don't have them in Greenland. Again, I'm sure we'll talk more about Greenland, but I wanted to make sure that everyone gets sort of a clear picture of how important the Arctic is to US security. That is an enduring interest. It's been something that's been part of US Arctic policy for 70 years, 75 years. And, it's a function of geography. The continental defense interest in the Arctic, it's not necessarily about the Arctic region itself. We're worried about missiles that would go over the Arctic coming from Eurasia. So, I think I have a Canadian colleague and dear friend who talks about threats to the Arctic, threats through the Arctic, and threats from the Arctic. And I think the missile threat is the classic example of a threat that comes to us through the Arctic region. So it's important to recognize that as well. And I will be able to show you in a minute, we'll talk a little bit more about the Russian threat. But here's a more detailed look at US military installations in Alaska and Greenland. Alaska is, one of, if not the most heavily militarized places in the United States. There's more fifth generation fighter aircraft in Alaska than anywhere else in the world. We have major installations across Alaska, interior, down in the Aleutians. And, it's important to note, I think, we don't have so much US military force collected in Alaska to defend Alaska, right? This is mostly about power projection into the Indo-Pacific, because Alaska is a great jumping off point to reach various places across the Indo-Pacific. And so those forces are generally, in Alaska to be able to be projected into the Indo-Pacific. They're under the control of Indo-PACOM. But it is a really important strategic place. From Alaska, you can get to most places in the world pretty quickly. It pushes us kind of deep into the Pacific, very strategic location. And again, it's sort of this forward base from which we can do things like missile defense and interception. And if you're looking up from North America, Alaska is sort of at your 10 o'clock, and then Greenland is kind of at your 2 o'clock. Thule Air Base, again, it was renamed Batufik a couple of years ago. The traditional Inuit place name was restored. So it's now Batufik Space Base. It is a space base now. But you can see it up in the northwest corner of Greenland, and it again is a forward location for radars pointed up over the Arctic region that give us that early warning. And then, between the 10 o'clock and the 2 o'clock, we have Canada. And, Canada has a variety of, we've got radars across northern Canada. These are all part of the NORAD binational Continental Defense Command that is based out of Colorado. But Alaska and Greenland are both really important to US defense. That's been recognized, for a long time. Greenland is part of the Kingdom of Denmark, and Denmark was a founding member of NATO, for this reason. Denmark itself is sort of far away and out of the Arctic, but Greenland brings Denmark into the Arctic, makes it an Arctic power, and makes it vitally important to the United States. And there's obviously connections through the NATO alliance as well as a strong bilateral alliance. And you can see Iceland on the chart on your right, and true as well, right? Iceland's a founding member of NATO, and there's strong bilateral and multilateral arrangements tying us to Iceland. These days, with the accession of Sweden and Finland to NATO following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Arctic region is made up of 7 NATO countries and Russia. So that has made regional governance a little bit more sensitive, as you can imagine. NATO countries here are in blue, and so you can see that it's sort of a NATO lake plus Russia. Russia is the largest Arctic country. It controls about half of the coastline of the Arctic Ocean. That makes it, sort of the heavyweight just by power of geography. And, the division now between NATO and Russia, I think, is pretty stark. It has made Arctic regional governance quite difficult in the last several years. I'm happy to talk about that, if anyone is interested, but I think we can go down a wormhole talking about Arctic governance, so I'm not planning on spending a lot of time on it, but there is a regional governance organization that has been pretty severely impacted by the impacts of the war in Ukraine. It's functioning, but at a more restrained level than it was before. And it's not a decision-making body, it's a consensus-based organization. But NATO is hugely important in the Arctic region. There hasn't been a strong focus on the Arctic by the NATO alliance historically. There's always been more concern on sort of eastern flank and some of the other issues. But in the last few years, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we've seen more interest by NATO in the Arctic. The last 6 months in particular, I think that has been jump-started, and we are now going to see, a strategic concept for the Arctic and more NATO presence in the Arctic developing. There's a mission, Arctic Sentry, that was launched in the last couple of months that really was driven, I think, by US rhetoric and sort of interests in Greenland. But it's great. Arctic Sentry is going to help kind of collect up some of the various efforts and exercises and trainings and operations that have been going on in and around the Arctic and make those a little bit more coherent. So I think it's important, and it's an important area for deterrence against Russia. So let's talk a little bit about Russia in the Arctic. There's a lot to unpack there. Sorry, I've got a couple of really dense charts here, but I think they'll be pretty helpful. So on the right-hand side, you can see sort of the entire Arctic region. On the right-hand side of that is the Russian coastline, and this gives you a nice graphic of various Russian military installations along its Arctic coastline. Russia is a large land power that has been invaded many times. And it's got its main defense is depth. It just falls back. The Russian military has fallen back because it is such a large country. It has historically been protected along its north coast by Arctic ice. That ice shield is retreating. And as I mentioned before, Russia is very interested in building a major international shipping lane along its northern coast, bringing in global shipping traffic. So Russia is newly insecure along its Arctic coastline. Some of that is a function of the changing environment, and some of that is a function of its own doing, seeking to bring in international shipping. But either way, there's a great deal of insecurity linked to the opening up of the Russian Arctic. And that is coupled with a deficit of security spending in the last couple of decades of the Cold War. So Russia was not maintaining its Arctic military facilities throughout the 1980s. There was obviously extensive loss in the 1990s and 2000s. As soon as the Russian state had sort of regained strength in the late 2000s, early 2010s, we saw Vladimir Putin begin investing in the Russian Arctic to rebuild, restore, and expand Russian military capabilities. That is coherent. It makes sense, right? There was a deficit of spending to overcome, and there were these new vulnerabilities that I have already mentioned. So we saw really sustained investment in the Russian Arctic to build out all sorts of capabilities, everything from installations and infrastructure that would support operations like airfields, a couple of small bases, communications, radar systems, a whole host of investments. Now, this is Russia. We're talking about the 20 teens here when we saw Russia's war in Georgia, we saw the seizure of Crimea. So there were signals that Russia was returning to aggressive disrespect for its neighbors' territory. And so its spending in the Arctic continues to make everyone very uncomfortable. I will say that most expert analysis concludes that Russian military spending in the Arctic is primarily defensive in nature. However, in Russian strategic thought, there isn't really a strong division between, offense and defense. If there was a major contingency, of course, this Arctic infrastructure would be used for a variety of operations. I don't think Russia is about to try to seize territory in the Arctic for a number of reasons. It's been stretched very thin by the war in Ukraine. It does not have the capacity to seize and hold anything of substance. It does not want a war with NATO. And again, the Arctic is now a NATO lake, right? And Russia wants to do business in the Arctic region, and war is bad for business. So I think there are a number of very strong reasons why I doubt Russia will initiate conflict in the Arctic. However, we could see something happening by accident. And I think, an accident or an unintended escalation would be the most likely path to conflict. On the left here, you can see an inset of, the concentration of Russian military forces and particularly strategic forces and strategic naval forces right next to northern Norway. So this is, in and around Murmansk. It's the part of Russia where there are year-round warm water harbors from which submarines can leave and escape out through the GI-UK gap, the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, down into the Atlantic. So, this area has been incredibly important for deterrence, for submarine and anti-submarine warfare for decades. And we've seen Russian subsurface submarine capabilities really remaining at a very high level. Russia has very good submarines. It has very good undersea capabilities writ large. It has the Googie part of its military apparatus, the undersea development shop that has, really continued to operate at a very high level. So, at the high end, Russian military capabilities have not been strongly degraded by the war, and the undersea capabilities remain a big piece of that. So the Arctic is really important to Russia for sort of core national interests. It is the Arctic is vital to Russia's security, to its strategic security, to its second strike nuclear capabilities. The Arctic is vital to Russia's economy. And, it's this increasingly unprotected coastline. So there's a lot of reasons why Russia feels very strongly about its Arctic in ways that I think sometimes we don't fully appreciate in the United States. In the United States, we don't really think of ourselves as an Arctic nation, and the Arctic is not sort of a core national interest. But in Russia, it is. It's very, very important. And I think that's something that I really want to make sure I foot stomp for you all today. So Russia has been building up its military capabilities in the Arctic. It retains, very high-end capabilities and strategic capabilities in the Western Arctic there, in the Kola Peninsula. And obviously that intersects with NATO's growing interest in the region. I'm just going to give you a quick look at some of Russia's commercial interests. I mentioned the shipping route, the Northern Sea Route, which you can see there, that long arrowed line across the Russian coastline. The dots there are hydrocarbon projects. Russia is a petrostate. It makes most of its income from pumping oil and gas. The war has impacted that. And over the last several decades, Russia has pumped out all of its easy to access hydrocarbons. Most of what's left now is in the Arctic. And again, these are resources that have been known about for 100 years, but it's been too expensive and difficult to get to them. It remains expensive. Russia is really reliant on foreign capital to get these projects off the ground. But Russia's economic vision for this century is to develop a major international shipping lane through the Arctic and use the income from that shipping lane to develop some of its, to leverage some of the development of these hydrocarbon projects. With the Strait of Hormuz closed and with really, chaos rippling through world oil markets, should sanctions on Russian oil and gas be lifted, we saw the U.S. issue a waiver to at-sea Russian hydrocarbons last month. If there's sort of more of a consensus around desanctioning Russian hydrocarbons, I think we'll see a significant uptick in production out of the Arctic, out of the Russian Arctic, because those hydrocarbons can be loaded onto tankers and sent east through the Bering Strait and down to Asia without going through any of the potential choke points like Hormuz. So I think there is some potential interest there, and that's something that Russia would very much like to see. Moving on, I'm going to just sort of foot stomp mining a little bit. As I said, there's a lot of minerals in the Arctic region. These are all various projects. You can see a lot in Russia. There's some across Canada and the United States. There are a lot of minerals in the Arctic. There are a lot of strategic minerals in the Arctic region. So I think there's growing interest. I will say that, like the hydrocarbons, mining in the Arctic is challenging because it's expensive, because the climate is terrible, and because there's not a lot of infrastructure. So the startup costs for an Arctic mine are higher. The operation costs are higher, and that has been a barrier to entry for a lot of mining companies for a long time. That remains the case. That's sort of fundamentally the problem with Greenland. We've heard a lot about interest in Greenland around strategic minerals. The price barriers are in place until those are resolved. I don't think there's going to be any more significant mining in Greenland. Similar with Alaska. During World War II and the Cold War, there was a lot of mining in Alaska and in Canada. It was war-driven. In the last several decades, we've just seen a lot of those projects close up because the economics don't work. It's cheaper to go somewhere else. But, with strategic minerals and the need there, if we saw more forward-leaning, sort of interest in things like grants, price guarantees, what have you, we might see a lot more mining in the Arctic. The minerals are there. It is the expense that is involved in getting them to market that has been a barrier so far. Happy to talk more about that if anyone's interested. I want to get a little bit into boundaries. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because it gets squirrely real fast, but this is a map of the Arctic region, and the takeaway here is that there are vanishingly few territorial disputes in the Arctic. So the idea that there's sort of a scramble for territory is very overblown. there are no onshore, there are no land boundary disputes in the Arctic. There is one remaining maritime boundary dispute in the Beaufort Sea between the United States and Canada. You can see that little tiny triangle between the sort of a lime green triangle between the US and Canada. So there's a small sliver of the Beaufort where we have a long-running dispute with Canada. I do not have concerns about that. Where there are overlapping claims is the center of the Arctic, and that is for the seabed. That's for the extended continental shelf out past the exclusive economic zone, so past 200 nautical miles. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea enables coastal states to make claims to extended continental shelf if they can prove that that seafloor is connected to their landmass. It's a complicated formula. It works through something called the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, which is a slow-moving UN commission. But Russia, Canada, and Denmark have overlapping claims to the seabed of the Central Arctic Ocean, where you see all those lines and dots in the middle. Most of them overlap over something called the Lomonosov Ridge, which is an undersea mountain range running from Russia down towards Greenland and Canada. The US unilaterally declared an extended continental shelf last year without going through the UN process. So there is a lot of uncertainty about the seabed of the Central Arctic Ocean. I will note that the US claim overlaps Canada's claim. So we have some overlapping claims. Under the terms of UNCLOS, states should be engaging in direct negotiations to resolve overlapping claims. We have not yet seen those negotiations commence. And I want to say just, while I don't think there's going to be war over the Central Arctic Ocean seabed, because it is, again, way offshore, out past 200 nautical miles. It is deep seabed. It's in the Arctic. So it is one of the least hospitable places to do things on the planet. And when we think about seabed mining, which is an industry in its infancy, we are just starting to see seabed mining in much more easy to work in areas of the Pacific, for example, like the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. The Central Arctic Ocean is not an easy place to mine. No one is going to be going up there anytime soon, so there is time to resolve these overlapping claims. So, again, I don't think there is no scramble for Arctic territory. I can talk more about the Central Arctic Ocean seabed if anyone is interested, but it's a very prospective set of claims that need to be resolved. I'm not very concerned about it spilling over into conflict. We see some claims that this is going to happen, and I don't find those persuasive right now under current circumstances. Okay. The last thing I want to leave you with is a great chart, a picture of the connections between the Arctic and the Pacific, because we tend to look a lot at the North Atlantic. We think about NATO, we think about the GI-UK gap. That's all very important. But I think it is really good to look at the ways in which the Arctic connects down and has this nexus to the Pacific. And again, we talked a little bit about Russian hydrocarbons potentially supporting Asian markets going right down through the Bering Strait to ports across Asia. There is really a potential commercial nexus there. We're seeing a lot more cooperation between Russia and China in and around the Arctic and the Bering Sea. Again, they have an uneasy relationship, but they are certainly aligned in certain areas. And again, sort of that strategic projection from Alaska down into Indo-PACOM. I think this is just a nice view that reminds us how much the Arctic Ocean connects not only to the Atlantic, but also to the Pacific. So I'm going to wrap up there, move into some questions. That was probably a lot, but I'm really looking forward to speaking with you about anything from security to economics to sea ice. Thank you. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Rebecca. Christina, are there any questions that have been gathered?
Sure, we have a few. Rebecca, is the Northwest Passage part of Canada, or do you consider it an international waterway? And is the Northern Sea Route an international seaway, or is it part of Russia? And who decides that?
Great question. Okay. So, I'm glad that the question came in about both the Northwest Passage and the Northern Sea Route. Both Canada and Russia interpret the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea to support their positions that those are internal waterways. So Canadians say that the Northwest Passage is Canadian waters. Russians say the Northern Sea Route is a Russian waterway. The United States' interpretation of UNCLOS is that those are both international straits. And lawyers look at this in a couple of different ways. They look at the language of UNCLOS. It is something that has to be interpreted. There's language in UNCLOS that sort of supports both parties. And there is no higher authority that will decide. So the US has sort of an agree to disagree situation with Canada. So on our agreement about the Northwest Passage, we they say the Canadian position is that US ships, US scientific research ships, need to give notice and request access. We say they don't have to. It's an international strait. So under our agreement with Canada, we notify them that we're coming through and they grant us permission. So everybody's sort of happy. There are periodic sort of crises in this relationship. It has been a bit of a political football now and then. But yeah, we fundamentally disagree. And there's no easy way to thread that needle. Similarly, on the Russian side, we say the Northern Sea Route is an international strait. The Russians say it's internal. The US Navy conducts freedom of navigation operations around the world to contest what we consider excessive maritime claims. So there's periodic conversations around conducting freedom of navigation operations or FONOPs in Canada and Russia. Given sort of the delicacy of those relationships and the potential sort of ramifications, I think that's always something that's treated with a lot of care in the Pentagon and in the State Department. But it is, we have different interpretations, and that's something, again, that's sort of zero sum. It sort of has to be one or the other. It's not a particularly important point right now because there's not that much Arctic shipping. And from a US perspective, there's no real, it doesn't really make sense at all for the US to use the Northern Sea Route through the Russian coastline. That does not help the United States from a geographic shipping perspective. From the West Coast, we would head out that way. If we were going over, we would go through the Northwest Passage. So if shipping ticks up through the Northwest Passage, you can imagine that challenge coming a little bit more to the fore. But again, sailing through the Northwest Passage is difficult. And right now it still makes more sense for most US ships to go through Panama, for example. When we see, for example, the US Coast Guard transiting the Northwest Passage, we're always, those transits are planned months in advance, and they're always very careful to have, Canadian personnel aboard and to be conducting scientific research and to give advance notification and kind of stay within the terms of that bilateral agreement. So that's a long-winded answer, but the short sort of takeaway is it depends on who you ask, and there is no one who can give us the answers. Unfortunately, we're going to have to figure that one out on our own.
Got you. Our next question is, Greenland would seem to be integral to U.S. defense plans, for example, the Golden Dome. But the Patuxent Space Base in Greenland, according to reports, is falling apart. So if Greenland is so important for the U.S. missile defense, then why do you think that the only major facility we have there is being allowed to crumble?
I think I would say reports of its demise are a little bit overstated. We are having problems in Patuxent with permafrost degradation. So, a lot of The Arctic is, the landmass is made up of permafrost, which is permanently frozen soil that has an amount of ice mixed in with it. So it's soil and ice mixed together. It's very, very hard. It has been a really good substrate to build upon for a long time, but as temperatures go up across the Arctic, that permafrost is increasingly degraded. And we are seeing some really significant problems with the ground thawing under installations, under buildings, under airstrips. It is not just a problem in Greenland, although it is, thawing permafrost is a real problem in Batufik. And a lot of the installations are going to have to be re-engineered to have more stability with the permafrost degradation. It is a major problem across Alaska as well. And, the Canadians are having some issues with it as well. So I think, that challenge is something the Pentagon put out a report on, permafrost across Alaska and Greenland, across, U.S. military installations a few years ago that is really interesting. It's worth a read. We're also seeing in Alaska some problems around wildfire and military installations. And another challenge is coastal erosion. So Alaska in particular has some of the highest rates of coastal erosion in the world. And, some of the U.S. military radar installations, for example, are on the coastlines, and the erosion is forcing us to relocate some of that hardware further inland or to harden the coast. So we're seeing a set of costs, re-engineering costs associated with U.S. military installations in the Arctic that I think kind of further, I've sort of alluded to this a few times, but there's a really high cost to doing business in the Arctic. And that is also true for the US military. And that is always, I think, going to be a brake on development. So, there's a lot of talk right now about potential new US military bases in Greenland. There's going to be a really big price tag associated with those. And as the questioner has already pointed out, we have some work to do already on what we already have around Batufik and around Alaska. So I have a little bit of skepticism around seeing some of those new bases come in, just like given the price tag associated with maintaining what we already have, adapting to thawing permafrost, before we even get to building out new capabilities. But, you're absolutely right. Greenland is very important to U.S. defense. It's strategic geography, and it's really important that we have crucial, early warning capabilities based there. Absolutely. So thank you. Great question.
All right. We have about 8 minutes left, so I'm going to read. There's 2 more questions. While Greenland has been the focus of U.S. attention in the far north, what about Adak in the Aleutian Islands? Is the U.S. looking in the wrong direction?
So Adak is a former Navy and Air Force base in the Aleutians that used to be really substantial. It doesn't get a lot of notice, but the Aleutian campaigns was, I think, 1942 to 43. Don't quote me on that. I might be wrong. But it was a really hard-fought campaign of World War II. The Japanese actually landed forces in the Aleutians and seized and held a few islands. U.S. forces had a really difficult time to get them out. And so there were some bases, including Adak. Atu was another U.S. installation. And there's been a lot of interest in recent years in reopening them. Adak in particular, Senator Sullivan of Alaska has been pushing for that pretty heavily and has secured some funds in recent years to get that going. Again, I think I had that graphic of all the U.S. military installations in Alaska. It is a great jumping off point to the Indo-Pacific. And I think there's always going to be a conversation about, what the right balance of forces is. But I think, again, I'm going to go back to what I just said a little while ago. It's really expensive to do things up there. A rough kind of rule of thumb in the Arctic is that it's about 5 to 10 times as expensive as anything in the lower 48 because of the distances, the harsh climate, the lack of infrastructure, what have you. So, if you go up to northern Alaska to some of the small villages there, you see milk for $10 or $15 a gallon. It's the cost structure that you're dealing with is something that we're just not familiar with in the lower 48. So building out ADAC would be very expensive. And it also has a pretty significant burden of contamination from its historic use by the US military. So there's some remediation costs that are going to be have another really significant price tag. It was closed, I think, as one of the BRAC realignments in the around 1990 or so. So, I think there's a lot of interest. The senator certainly has been advocating, but it's going to be a really big price tag. So I think it's one of those questions where, you always have to kind of look at the total pie, the total Pentagon budget, and then where you have some free space, and then do kind of a rack and stack of prioritization. And if the priority is to getting that base reopened, then it'll make sense. And if there's other higher needs, then I think it's going to continue to slip. And I think, for the last few years, it's been one of those situations where we've just seen it sort of not clear that top hurdle. But that could always change. And, if the Pentagon budget gets juiced the way that, they're talking about, then there might be a lot of funding, right? I mean, we're at this point right now where we're talking about ADAC, more, needs in Alaska. There's a lot of talk about Greenland. And then you have to put that against sort of the whole world of needs across DoD. And so it's just always a question of prioritization.
Great. Okay, last question. Is there any strategic connection between the Arctic, the Iranian war, the Ukraine war, Russia, the US, and China?
Yes, I can tie all that together. And I think, I've kind of alluded to it a little bit before. I think, Russia's major hope is to, drill for Arctic hydrocarbons. That's its economic plan for this century. Russia's a petrostate, it's an arms dealer, but it's a petrostate, and its Arctic hydrocarbons are kind of what it's got left in the bank. So it really, really wants to have normalized relations in the Arctic. It really wants those sanctions lifted. It really, really wants to drill for hydrocarbons in Yamal and, some of the other places I showed you on that map. And it wants to put all those hydrocarbons on tankers and send them, either west to Europe or east to Asia. These days, probably just east to Asia through the Bering Strait and down to China, which is, its biggest customer, to India, to Vietnam, to, wherever. The closure of Hormuz due to the conflict with Iran right now is making every, oil and gas consumer, many oil and gas consumers, particularly in Asia, think more seriously, I would say, about buying from Russia. So if this drags on, if Hormuz stays closed, if Asian countries start getting desperate, then I think Russia is going to have more customers, and that will strengthen Russia. It will improve its bottom line. If it makes more money, if it can sell more hydrocarbons, it's got more money to spend on artillery and missiles it can shoot at Ukraine, and the war keeps going, right? I think that's the question. The sanctions have been focused on Russian oil and gas. They've been focused on the Russian Arctic to try and choke off that artery. And they have been very successful. Russia has some major hydrocarbons project in the Arctic that has not been able to bring online or develop further because of sanctions. If the sanctions are relaxed, or if key countries abandon the effort because they're desperate for oil and gas from Russia, then, Russia will be re-energized. It may, we're at this point where it's amazing. Ukraine has basically fought Russia to a standstill. But this year, I think, is going to be really critical. And what happens in Hormuz is really, really critical. And the Arctic is kind of the geography at the center of it. So yeah, I think they're all intimately interconnected.
Great.
Well, we come to the hour. Dr. Pincus, many thanks for all your comments. We appreciate it greatly. We learned a tremendous amount this afternoon. So thank you. And thank you all of our audience for attending. It was great to have you aboard for this hour. And we'll say goodbye. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.